peaceful scene is Granite Lake in North Idaho. It sits about 6 miles north of the town of Athol at an elevation of about 2,100 feet. As picturesque as it is today, on Friday, March 2nd, 1962, this was the site of a terrible railroad tragedy. This is a story of the fatal derailment of the Northern Pacific Railroad's North Coast Limited. The Northern Pacific Railway, or NP, began construction in 1870 and was finished in 1883, with trackage stretching along most of the northern United States. The North Coast Limited was an NP passenger train between Seattle and Chicago and began service in around 1900. It operated until 1971, when Amtrak service began. However, in late winter 1962, a North Coast Limited train entered sharp 30-mile-per-hour curve at Granite Lake, traveling between 75 to 80 miles per hour, with tragic results. The train derailed just before reaching the trestle over the Granite Lake. The locomotives reportedly went airborne down a steep embankment and into the water. Many of the passenger cars left the track. The engineer and fireman were killed in the crash. Both were experienced railroaders, the engineer having run trains throughout this region since 1916. The train's fireman was also a qualified engineer, having been promoted as such in 1950. Their train was led by 3 diesel locomotives. The lead unit was F7A6508A, middle unit F7B6512B, and an F9A number 6700C. And yes, in the 60s there were firemen even on diesels. It was a moonless winter night. The temperature outside was 28 degrees Fahrenheit. Several inches of fresh snow lay on the ground. The passengers aboard the North Coast Limited were mostly asleep or settling in for the night. Visibility was not great, but more than good enough for safe railroading. Snow powder was blowing up and around the rail cars as the North Coast Limited traveled westbound. In the lead power was 63-year-old engineer Jesse J. Pruitt and 51-year-old fireman Stephen F. Renner. Conditions were such that the brakeman, who was in the rear car's vestibule, was unable to perform routine visual inspections of the train to make sure all was well as it rounded the curves due to the blowing snow. The train was often exceeding track speed limits that night. This wasn't terribly uncommon in the 1960s, and a new speed record had just been set in this district. The engineer was intending to break it. However, the train was already on track to break the record and had slowed to normal track speeds as it was approaching Granite Lake. The long stretch of track leading up to the 30-mile-per-hour curve was unremarkable and allowed high speeds. As the train approached this curve, the fireman was at the locomotive's controls. Remember, he was a qualified engineer, and it was not uncommon for the fireman to take over driving the train in these days, as it was on-the-job training. It appears the fireman lost situational awareness, that is, he did not know that they were rapidly approaching the curve. The engineer, no longer at the controls, was distracted and not aware that the fireman was lost. The fireman blew the horn for a crossing just 700 feet from the curve, so everything appeared to be normal. He didn't know where he was and likely knew to blow the standard "Here comes the train," long, long, short, long pattern on the horn due to seeing a W signpost. However, he was alert, in control, and was driving the train. Shortly after crossing, the gleaming tops of the rails and the headlights ahead showed a sharp curve to the left they were barreling towards. It has been suggested that the engineer may have realized the fireman's mistake at the sound of the horn and attempted to activate the emergency brake. But the train was traveling far too fast with not enough track left before the bend. At 75 miles per hour, they would have reached the curve less than 7 seconds after passing the level crossing. Railroaders familiar with this route knew that brakes must be set for the curve by the east switch of granite siding. Even if they waited until they passed the advance warning sign for the speed change, they didn't have enough time. The train was already past that point. At 10:18 p.m., the train reached the Granite Lake curve, curve number 25, at high speed. The locomotives flew off the track and down a 400-foot embankment toward the water's frozen surface. The engines impacted with a flat piece of land on the water's edge and then went into the lake. The leading unit and the B unit behind it sank beneath the soft mud at the bottom. They were completely buried under the lake bed by several feet. The train smashed through the trees and telephone poles. The third diesel came to a rest at the edge of the lake, followed by a baggage car and a mail car, which followed the locomotives down the embankment. Many passengers were thrown through the air or injured by flying debris. They were cut by broken glass and had many broken bones. Rail cars were off the tracks, many on their sides. One passenger car landed about 100 feet from the tracks, having plowed through a snow-covered field. The 5 rearmost cars left the tracks but remained upright. When everything came to a stop, there was silence broken only by the muffled whimpers of the injured. Doors to the passenger cars were jammed shut, and windows had to be smashed out with fire axes to evacuate the cars. Survivors found themselves among the wreckage in the dark of the night in below-freezing conditions. The train's stewardess, Peggy Stewart, went through the cars tending to the wounded. She was helped by 2 student nurses who were passengers on the train and sprang into action, doing all that they could without access to medical equipment. Rescuers were dispatched from nearby Athol, but one of the survivors noted that it took some time before help arrived. Upon arrival, medics and sheriff deputies moved quickly through the cars, giving first aid to the injured. They found some shocked passengers wandering around dazed, having escaped the wreckage into the frozen night air. Some passengers walking through the deep snow were dressed only in night clothes, and a few had left their shoes behind. Those who were able moved into the derailed but upright rear cars of the train, some of which still had functioning lights and heat. Others were warmed by campfires lit by the first responders who arrived at the crash site. Despite the horrific scene, no passengers died in the crash. The only fatalities were the rail crew and the lead locomotive. Although the wreck claimed no additional lives, 96 were injured and transported to hospitals in the area. One boy, 7 years old, came terrifyingly close to death in the back of an ambulance racing along the icy highways heading north to a hospital in Sandpoint, Idaho. The incident was investigated by the Interstate Commerce Commission, or ICC, as the NTSB didn't get established until 1967. The conclusion in the report was not definitive and simply stated the cause of the wreck was the train was traveling too fast to negotiate the curve. It would be many years before the full details of what happened that night became known. Several rumors or suspicions resulted, however. There was speculation that a track defect caused the accident, but the evidence at the scene did not support this. The track was recently maintained and was in good order. There were no marks from where the train derailed, indicating that it hit the ground and skidded along it. The train essentially flew from the tracks. There were rumors of intoxication on part of the crew, but this was false. The train had had brake problems recently with its sophisticated electro-pneumatic brake system, which was designed to prevent wheel slide, much like anti-lock brakes in cars. But this problem was not a factor in the accident. In fact, it was disconnected earlier and the train was operating on normal air brakes, which would have been perfectly suited to keep the train under control. Ultimately, no malfunction of any equipment or track problems contributed to the accident. It was human error. Despite the curve's 30-mile-per-hour limit, engineers calculated that the overturning speed of the train, with its configuration, weight, fuel, and other factors accounted for, would have been 69 miles per hour. The train's speed was estimated to be 75 to 80 at the time of the derailment, despite the fact that speed tape in the locomotive was destroyed in the accident. In the aftermath, all engines and rail cars were recovered from the site. The two leading locomotives had to be extracted from the mud under the lake. It took a few weeks after the disaster to locate and remove them. It was then that they discovered the fireman was at the controls, as this is where his body was found. There have been rumors ever since that there is still railroad equipment in the lake. This is actually true. Not full cars or engines, but pieces of them. Specifically, the leading trucks from all three locomotives were broken free and lost in the lake. They were never found and are likely dozens of feet below the muddy bottom of the lake bed. The two leading locomotives were unsalvageable, but the third unit was repaired and returned to the rails. In fact, it became a Burlington Northern asset after Northern Pacific merged with other railroads to form the BN. BN later merged with Santa Fe to become BNSF, which operates the tracks in this area today. NP made several critical improvements after the accident, including changes to their operating culture. An emphasis was placed on following the rules and adhering to speed limits more strictly, although the train's high speeds earlier that day in an attempt to break the record were not a direct factor in this incident. The tracks where the accident took place were realigned in 1965 to remove that dangerous curve. That new alignment is to the east of the old track and is still in heavy use today. All that remains of the original route are several concrete pilings which once served as the foundation of the trestle over the lake and some visible road bed, with the tracks long since removed. Part of what was the original route is now a roadway leading to the lake. Northern Pacific's efforts to improve safety were somewhat successful. Never again did an NP train derail due to this type of error. However, this was not the only tragedy on the North Coast Limited. Although the circumstances were quite different, another train derailed just 3 months later in June of 1962 in the Avaro Hill accident near Missoula, Montana. This second crash resulted in the death of a passenger, 2-year-old Teresa Dooms. The Avaro incident became better known possibly because of a passenger fatality. In this case, the cause was a rail crew who was intoxicated on the job and had fallen asleep at the controls. But Avaro is a story for another day.